All the way back on May 3rd, 1902, a small light railway began construction to open up the agricultural area of central Suffolk. The railway would eventually be known as the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway, otherwise known as the Middy, and while the line did see significant use over the years, it was never successful. At all. In fact, its construction and operation was largely considered a complete and total disaster, made worse by absurd amounts of mismanagement, as well as the managers constantly putting themselves into repeated debt, like crippling debt, in order to make what amounted to a lost cause of a railway actually work. It never really worked, at least not in its original form. The concept for the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway, well, it really got started all the way back in 1896, when the Light Railways Act was passed. It was an act of parliament that greatly reduced the overall cost of constructing a light railway in the UK by streamlining the processes for getting authorization to actually do so. Many railways would benefit from the act, and one would ultimately be the Middy. An application for a light railway order was made in May of 1899, and the commissioners held an inquiry in Ipswich on July 6, 1899. But the line was already considered pretty ambitious. It was supposed to be 50 miles long, and it was described by its supporters as the most important light railway scheme to be brought before the commissioners since the Light Railway Act of 1896. The new network was supposed to interconnect the Ipswich to Norwich Main Line and the East Suffolk Line, and it would be standard gauge for the UK, 4 foot 8.5 inches. During the hearing, the Great Eastern Railway was cautiously supportive of the idea, and after some further negotiation, the overall plans were reduced to just 42 miles, which was still fairly long, and the Mid-Suffolk Light Railway order was made on the 5th of April, 1900. And with approval in hand, the directors jumped on getting started. The construction contract was awarded to S. Pearson & Sons on July 27, 1900. But after a few months, Pearson & Sons were getting annoyed. They hadn't actually been told to start building, and they don't get paid till they do that, so can they do that, or... Well, what's going on, guys? The delay seems to be related to securing subscribed capital, and this is going to be a running theme, getting actual money to build stuff. That's super relevant whenever you're, well, building anything, honestly. In fact, it would be over a year for them to figure this out. At a board meeting on the 23rd of November 1901, the engineers would explain that there was a lot of difficulty in making the line near the River Blythe at Halesworth, and that they should probably build it not there. At this point, the company's bankers were asked to give an overdraft of £1,000 to pay for more surveys, pending the issue of shares. And it wasn't until December of 1901 that a prospectus was published for the share issue. Half the share capital was being offered now as ordinary shares, with the second half to be issued later as preference shares. But S. Pearson & Sons resigned from the contract at this point, because frankly they just hadn't been allowed to do anything. It was a waste of their time. So S. Jackson of London was appointed instead, who were finally permitted to actually get to work on May 3rd, 1902, in a field at Westerfield, and recognized that the company had obviously already been having financial difficulties, so you'd think that they'd want to, be a little frugal when it came to spending. No. Even at this early stage, they threw an extravagant luncheon to celebrate the start of construction, with at least 600 guests, many who were brought in by special trains, and the Duke of Cambridge performed the ceremony. Naturally, this ridiculous and unnecessary display did not help their savings, and thus, on July 22nd, 1902, they had to further overdraft £15,000, and that would not be the last time they would do that. At the general meeting in August of 1903, it was announced that further overdrafts had indeed been taken due to poor take-up of the preference shares. People just weren't buying into the company, so they didn't have the money they thought they would. They were counting on all this interest, and nobody was really that keen. By the end of that year, the bankers had made it clear that they weren't going to let the company overdraft anymore, because no. And the directors were said to be surprised by that. Really, you were shocked? You don't understand why the bank would not want you to overdraft anymore. At all. After you've done it multiple times. Are you kidding me? They were given an opportunity to make some quick cash in April of 1904, though. The Treasury informed them that they would advance £25,000 as a grant as long as East Suffolk County Council advanced a similar sum. The council said no. So, great. Thanks, guys. But they did manage to get things mostly together. The line was finally opened between Haughley and Laxfield to goods traffic on September 20th, 1904. There was still a lot of work to do, but they could at least run trains. But their first train really wasn't very profitable. There was no ordinary goods traffic to convey. So the first load was actually just ballast wagons that were required by the contractor further down the line. And the locomotive they used wasn't even theirs. It was on loan. Their locomotive was available, but the manufacturer didn't believe that they could actually pay them for the locomotive, so they didn't release her at first. To be fair, they did manage to have the money set aside for the locomotive, so they did have that priority in order. And they had a second locomotive by March of 1905. But the big problem they were having is passenger service, namely the lack of an ability to do that. They wanted to get that started by January of 1905, but there were rules in place that a company must adhere to in order to provide that service. Namely, the line had to be inspected by an officer of the Board of Trade before passenger service was permitted. That hadn't been done, so they literally weren't allowed to run passengers, and in those days, passenger service was a pretty profitable venture. People wanted to use trains to travel because they were simply the fastest way to do so, and not being able to supply that regular service was causing the company to bleed money. Freight traffic was never as strong as they thought it would be, and it was not able to prop up their situation on its own. Things got even worse when the company's chairman resigned at the end of March 1905. His name was Francis Seymour Stevenson. After his resignation, it became known that he was personally bankrupt. And with that, plus the contractor parting ways with the company, it put their whole reputation on a horrific stage for all to see. When the debtors came calling, there was no money to actually pay off those debts. They had to sell some land at Westerfield, which they had wanted to build a line on, to the Great Eastern Railway, and used that money to pay some of the debt down in order to buy themselves some more time. It wasn't until July 2nd, 1905, when an inspector finally showed up to clear them for passenger operation, Lieutenant Colonel P.G. von Donop. But there were a large number of deficiencies that he observed, and von Donop told them no to passenger service. He refused, and that was bad. That was really, really bad. They decided in 1906 to extend the line by over a mile and a half to Cratfeld, and that was opened by June of 1906, but that still really wasn't helping them, and even if service had been good, their actual management style was just the worst. They were never able to get enough money in order to pay off their debts or even make the debtors that happy. They were forced to enter bankruptcy in October of 1906, and a receiver was appointed on the 6th of that month, J.F.R. Daniel. And his first priority was to actually get them authorized for passenger service. For the love of everything, why hadn't that been done yet? You took the time to extend the line, but you didn't take the time to make everything else suitable for passengers? What are you doing? Daniel made every effort to get things up to snuff for von Donop's follow-up inspection, and he would return by September 25th, 1908. He wasn't thrilled with the progress made, but he did acknowledge that enough had been done that it could pass. So they were finally authorized for passenger service, and that started on September 29th, 1908. But over the following years, nothing they did seemed to fix anything. They suspended service on part of the line in February 1912, and the directors, sitting in the background of the receiver, were still just not fully grasping the situation they were in, like, at all. They had no real control over the company because it was in receivership, and they sought advice from the railway commissioners about reviving the extension to Halsworth that had been closed. Why they wanted to do this, I do not know, and none of them seemed to fully grasp that they really had no way of doing this. The reply, in fact, made it very clear that they really genuinely had no way of doing this. The railway commissioners told them they would have to purchase their line back from the receiver and obtain the consent of their debtors, as well as their preference shareholders. In other words, they were never going to be able to pull that off. The rail line did continue to move forward throughout World War I, but by the time the war was over, there was a huge backlog of maintenance, and their income was falling. It was even worse than it already had been, but they would shortly be bailed out. The Railways Act of 1921, otherwise known as the Grouping, would merge the vast majority of the railways in Great Britain into just 4 companies, otherwise known as the Big Four. And in the Middy's case, they were to be absorbed by the London and North Eastern Railway, LNER. But even that plan was full of nonsense, because, well, they were still in receivership, and there were large liabilities, and uncertainty of exactly how to merge them, while at the same time settling the debts involved. £89,794 was still owed, but LNER stepped in and negotiated to get it reduced to just £29,960, something they could indeed afford. The dispute was finally resolved on April 3rd, 1924, but the line was never seen as a moneymaker. Quite the opposite, in fact. The viability of passenger operation in general came under scrutiny. From 1925 to 1928, bookings from the stations had reduced from 3,296 to just 2,162, and takings on the line by 1930 amounted to only £990. That was it. During that time, there was a serious consideration to just turn the line into a straight-up road, because why bother with it anymore? But that was found to be too impractical and cost more money, so they didn't bother with it. During World War II, the passenger service was reduced to just 2 trains each way, daily, and that schedule would remain for the remaining lifetime of those lines. And eventually, the decision was made to just close it down. All service on the line was withdrawn on July 28, 1952, with the whole thing later being ripped up. But that's not the end of this ridiculous story. Yeah, the Middy was plagued with mismanagement and constant financial problems and was never really that busy or profitable in any way at all. As a business, it was a complete and total failure. There is no question about that. But it was still loved, in a way. Locals liked having the railway around, and 40 years after the lines closed, a group of enthusiasts formed a company to recreate it. The Mid-Suffolk Light Railway Society did manage to put some of it back together again, and even extended it in 2017. As far as anyone knows, there's no original rolling stock from the first Middy remaining in existence, but they still have a bunch of other rolling stock there, and the locomotives are mostly on loan at the moment. They are in the process of restoring one of their own, however, and generally speaking, it's actually been a lot more successful as a heritage line than it ever was as a business. It's nice to see that even the most poorly managed lines can sometimes get a happy ending. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsu 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Raro Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hoff 444, that guy with a beard, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isaac for 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Albert Jaspers, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, Dr. Racer 78, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, and Ohio Trucker 1. Till next time, this is Darkness, individual of fun. Farewell.